Hi, everyone. I'm Will Walker, and this is a theme preview for National History Day 2023, Frontiers in History, People, Places, Ideas. So what's a frontier? Well, according to the dictionary, it is a border between two countries, a region that forms the margin of settled or developed territory, a line of division between different or opposed things, a new field for exploitative or developmental activity. So mostly geographical in that definition, but also suggesting that there are other ways to think about this idea of a frontier. How about National History Day? What does National History Day say? Well, National History Day says that a frontier is a wilderness at the edge of a settled area or an uncharted territory, which kind of raises the question, uncharted for who or for whom. The formal border between two countries or societies, particularly when they are hostile. So again, that sort of geographical understanding of a frontier. But National History Day also says that ideas could be frontiers. So a frontier could be an undeveloped field of study. It could refer to the limits of knowledge or achievement in a particular activity or subject. A frontier could refer to those who challenge conventional thinking and imagine new ways of doing things, or those who challenge traditional boundaries of race, class, and gender, for example. It could also refer to uncharted intellectual or spiritual territory, such as new philosophies, religions, and ways of governing. So there are lots of ways to think about frontiers that are not strictly geographical. So in a broad sense, National History Day with this theme is encouraging us to think of frontiers, of course, as places, that's one way, but also in terms of people and ideas. So what might that look like? So I work in the museum field, and museums are a visual medium, so we often like to look at images. So of course, a classic way of thinking about the frontier or frontiers is represented in this image, in this painting by Emanuel Leutze. Some of you may recognize as the artist who painted Washington crossing the Delaware. This is another of his pieces. This is actually in the US Capitol building, and it's called Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. And you can see in here, kind of classic images of settlers, of pioneers, their wagons sort of going west. You could see the mountains, probably the Rocky Mountains off in the distance there, or the Appalachian Mountains, right? So this idea of westward expansion, westward movement in North America from the East Coast out into the West. We could take a different perspective on that same story if we think about the history of the Trail of Tears and forced removal of indigenous people. So what's the perspective of indigenous nations on this story of the frontier of westward migration? Right? Could we think about, to use the historian Dan Richter's phrase, think about facing east from Indian country as these invaders are coming in. Think about the consequences of settlers or even settler colonialists moving into indigenous peoples' ancestral homelands, right? And what were the consequences of that? Continuing on this line of thinking about indigenous perspectives, we might explore the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Some people may know the Haudenosaunee as Iroquois, right, as the Iroquois Confederacy. And, their confederacy is built on this understanding, this agreement among different nations to cooperate, to be a political unit, that this is a deeply influential concept for the United States, for the founders in the United States, and it's one that's enduring, right, to today. So that's another way we might think about frontiers, both in terms of that story of westward expansion, but also in terms of diplomatic innovation, political innovation, right, on the part of indigenous people. Of course, another way to approach this topic, really from a geographical perspective, but it takes us into the realm of politics and diplomacy and migration, the movement of people, is to think about these borders or borderland regions, right? Borderlands is a whole fascinating field of study today. So we might think about something like the Berlin Wall in the context in which it was constructed in the Cold War, right? Or go way back to the construction of the Great Wall of China, or more contemporary, relevant to our situation today, our politics today, the wall at the U.S.-Mexico border, the barrier that exists there in many places on the border. Of course, we could also think about, space, the final frontier, right? That's one place that your minds may go to, your students' minds may go to in approaching this theme of frontiers, and that's certainly appropriate. And there are many ways to tackle this topic. So I've shared a picture of the International Space Station. That's certainly one way to think about it, but there are many. Shifting into people, right? There are countless fascinating figures here, pioneers, innovators, iconoclasts, geniuses, thought leaders who really have transformed society, science, the arts, literature, music, you name it. So just a small sampling here, we might think of someone like Toni Morrison and her literary innovations, not only in subject matter, but in the style of writing, the approach. Or in the sciences, Marie Curie or Albert Einstein, right, and their work in physics and in chemistry. Or someone like Ornette Coleman, who was a real innovator, a free spirit in jazz, who transformed jazz, the art form of jazz, and making it freer, sort of pioneering this idea of free jazz. So lots of ways, lots of people that could fit into this theme of frontiers. Of course, also ideas. There are so many world-changing ideas that we can point to. Just a small sampling again here, maybe Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was thinking about the development of capitalism as an idea, as an ideology, as a system, or critiques of capitalism, right? Or alternatives developed by people like Karl Marx through works like Das Kapital. Or thinking about race and gender, how thinkers have really challenged us to change our minds, to change our societies and our structures and our systems. So someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, vindication of the rights of women, really challenging sort of entrenched ideas of gender, or Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and sort of bringing a very critical anti-racist perspective to US and really global culture. So how do you select a topic? I mean, this is always one of the big challenges at any level, right? From middle school all the way through graduate school and beyond. The challenge of sort of selecting a topic and then narrowing that topic. It's fun, it's exciting, but it also can be frustrating, I know. So where to start? always think creatively about topics, and you know, as instructors, might be thinking about your curriculum, and that's great, that's fine. You know, maybe students are inspired by something they hear in class or they read about to want to know more. But you could certainly also go beyond the curriculum. Many of the National History Day topics that I've seen have really gone beyond kind of the standard curriculum. This is really an opportunity to expand for students to investigate something that is related to things that they might be studying in the classroom, but you don't have time to really dig into. So, you know, don't be limited by the curriculum. It could be a starting point, but there's also an opportunity here for students to go beyond the curriculum. Think about student interests and topics that might appeal to them. You know, what are they into? What might they like? A little bit of guidance, a suggestion from a teacher who knows a student, knows their interests, could be very helpful in this area. Consider local, state, national, and global events of historical and contemporary significance. So just what's going on in the world? You know, what are sort of relevant things to your community, to our state, to our country, to the world, right? That's also a great way to identify topics, to get students excited. And also when you get to the point where you have to think about the relevance, the historical significance, it's a little bit easier, right? If you've selected a topic that, you know, right from the get-go, you kind of have a sense this is relevant, right? This is significant. I get how this history is informing the present. And then finally, consider the sources, right? What's available? What are the primary sources that students will be able to access? They might be really excited about a topic that, you know, it's going to be very difficult for them to research. You know, so just thinking from the beginning, I'm not saying shut down a topic, but, you know, thinking about what are the sources, how are they going to access those sources? Is the project doable, you know, in the time that they have? You can kind of, you know, narrow things down using this sort of system or structure, the pyramid here. You know, starting with a theme at the top, frontiers in history. Maybe that'll take you into, you know, something that a student is generally interested. Maybe they're into technology, so you're covering the Industrial Revolution. Okay, let's think about that. What within the Industrial Revolution interests a student? Well, they're really into the nuts and bolts of sort of how things go together. Okay, maybe they're interested in sort of advancements in production, right? How things are made. And that leads to a narrowing of the topic. Well, let's look at Henry Ford. Let's look at, you know, Model T or the assembly line, right? How did that work? You know, and that could then lead to a research question of how did these inventions, how did this, you know, kind of approach to production affect the frontier of American industry? And ideally that will take the student to a thesis statement or a historical argument. Okay, we all know it doesn't always work that easily. It's not always that clean, but it in general, you know, you're moving through this sort of narrowing process. Look, what are you generally interested in? Let's kind of try to narrow that down and identify something specific that you can really, the student can really sink their teeth into and generate historical questions and ultimately a historical argument about. You know, one of the things that I'd like to encourage, National History Day, I think would like to encourage, is to think outside the box here. You know, I think about frontiers, okay, sort of classic stories of the West jump to mind, maybe space, but there are a lot of topics that could fit under this theme. So, you know, what about the arts? What about sports? You know, we have students who are interested in sports. There's plenty of relevant sports history. Science, technology, medicine, you know, all of these things could fit under this theme. So just some examples here of, you know, possible topics. Maybe New Orleans and the birth of jazz, right? That's a frontier, absolutely. It's a new art form. An abstract artist like Carmen Herrera, who was unrecognized for a long time, but has recently received recognition as a really pioneering, important abstract artist. Racial integration in baseball. So Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, maybe some other lesser known figures in baseball and in this struggle to integrate Major League Baseball. Different sport, basketball. Someone like Denise Long, who was the first woman drafted by an NBA team. Lesser known figure, but that could really spark the interest of a student, and certainly a very relevant story. Maybe you have a student who's really into science and technology. They might want to look at artificial intelligence or robotics, two really exciting areas of technological growth and development right now. Or maybe they want to look at the history of science and are looking for women role models in the history of science. So someone like Mary Anning, a pioneering paleontologist, early paleontologist. Or maybe they want to think about deep sea exploration. You've got a student who's into marine biology. That's a frontier as well. Our minds jump to space, but what about the oceans? I mean, there's just as much that is really unexplored there still. So in general, encourage creativity. I know realistically, you got to get them to a topic and find the sources and go through the process. But it's very important, especially at the beginning, to encourage students to think creatively and expansively about topics that relate to the theme, and also about sources that could support their topic. So briefly, a little bit about sources. This is not primarily about finding sources, but just some general guidance. Always great to connect with librarians and archivists. In all the research I have ever done, librarians and archivists have been critically important. Search online primary sources. So, kind of going beyond the Google search, actually maybe starting with some of these repositories like the Library of Congress or the National Archives. We have great resources in New York State, the State Archives, the New York Public Library, the Center for Brooklyn History, the New York Heritage Site, also the Smithsonian. I can't speak highly enough of the Native Knowledge 360 website. If you haven't checked it out yet, you haven't heard of it, I would strongly encourage you to check it out. Just great information, guidance, lesson plans, primary sources, all kinds of things related to Indigenous, Native American history. So yeah, definitely check it out. You can find primary source sets online. The Library of Congress has them. Center for Brooklyn History has them. Other institutions have put these together as well. Really, really helpful starting points. Of course, encourage students to mine the notes and bibliographies of secondary sources, and go beyond texts. Historians are sort of notorious for only looking at texts. And there's just a whole world of other kinds of historical sources, images, films, music, art. All of these things can be historical sources. So encourage your students to think visually and be creative in the kinds of sources they're pulling in. Of course, they're bringing, always critical analysis to this work. You want to work with your students and encourage them to, as they're identifying and analyzing primary sources, to ask questions. Who created this? When was it created? Why was it created? If you're doing visual analysis, what do you see? What do you think about what you see? What would you like to know more about? Obviously, consider the perspective and the bias, or you really want students to be thinking about perspective and getting multiple perspectives. Encourage them, help them to craft research questions and draw preliminary conclusions. And this is where the secondary sources can come in and be helpful. Well, what's this scholar saying, okay, how does that compare to what you're thinking about these primary sources? So what to look for, to understand the historical importance of their topics, students will be asked to demonstrate their topics' time and place, cause and effect, change over time, impact and significance, right? And remember, we want students to draw their own conclusions about how their topic affected individuals, communities, nations, or the world. Here are just a few questions that might be helpful in guiding student research specific to this theme. So, what factors contributed to the development of their frontier, whatever that is? Whether it's a place or person or an idea. Why did it emerge? How did it change, right? So really the importance of change over time. When did it cease to be a frontier, if that's an applicable question? What impact did it have on the different groups of people who experienced it, and how did they affect the frontier? So this is, gets at the impact not only on a single person or, one place or one community, but what is that broader impact? A few things to remember. National History Day wants to remind us that students need to demonstrate their topic's historical perspective. So again, thinking about the perspective, understanding the context. Examine the significance of their topic in history. So why does it matter? What's the relevance? What's the so what? They could share all sorts of interesting tidbits, interesting information about a topic, but if they're not explaining the significance, they're really not analyzing. And then show development and change over time. So that's what we as historians do. Again, a frontier can be more than a geographical place. Tried to make that point a few times here, but worth reinforcing. And then encourage students to find something that interests them. The more personal a project is, the more ownership your students are able to take over their research, right? So that you want something that they care about, that they're interested in, that they're motivated to learn more about. And then finally, just some goals of National History Day. What's the point of this? Why do it? Well, obviously, we want students to develop a historical argument supported by evidence. That's an important skill. But we also want them to discover an aspect of history that fascinates and inspires them. We want students to find personal connections to history. We want them to build essential skills for success in many fields, so not just to be historians. It'd be great if they all want to be historians, but we know that all of them aren't going to become historians. But the skills that they develop and hone in doing these projects really can contribute to their success in many fields. We want students to demonstrate the relevance of history to our contemporary world, to really explain why, to understand why history matters, how history shapes the present, and how it can influence the future. And then, we want students really to be creative and have fun. Ultimately, this should be fun and energizing for them. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure that our History Day staff and office would be happy to answer any questions, and we can share these slides as well. So good luck, and I hope that you have another productive year working on National History Day projects with your students. Thank you.